The baby was left alone in the biting cold, her tiny cries lost among broken metal and silence. No one came, no one noticed, until a stray dog, a soul just as forgotten, laid down beside her and refused to leave. This is the story of two broken hearts, and the miracle that saved them both. The city of Arvinholm woke under a thick blanket of mist, its towering glass structures and cracked sidewalks swallowed by a formless, shifting sea of gray. Cold seeped through the alleys and the vast expanse of the industrial district, where a forgotten scrapyard, once a bustling center of metal trade, now lay abandoned to rust and silence. Amidst the skeletal remains of old cars and twisted beams, a lone figure moved with silent purpose. A dog, battered by time and misfortune, yet still carrying an air of innate nobility. Aurum was a German shepherd of around 6 years old, with a coat once sleek, black, and rich tan, now dulled and patchy from neglect. His body was lean, too lean, the muscles under his skin prominent like shadows clinging to bone. His ears stood alert, high, and noble. The one bore a scar that split the fur down its edge, a memento from his past life as a trained K9 unit. In those days, Aurum had been a protector, a hero to men he once trusted. But when the funding dried up and his handler moved away, Aurum was abandoned, like the junk now surrounding him. Yet, even in abandonment, he carried the discipline etched into him through years of loyalty. He moved with deliberate grace, cautious but unbroken. As the morning stretched onward and the mist began to thin, Aurum's sharp senses caught a sound not belonging to the clatter of metal or the scuttling of rats. A soft whimper, almost swallowed by the vastness of the scrapyard, drifted to his ears. His body tensed, then shifted, paws moving nimbly across shards of rusted debris as he followed the noise. He stopped before a battered metal drum half buried under a pile of tires, his nose twitching, drawing in the scent. Foreign, fragile, human. Nudging aside the tires with his strong snout, Aurum uncovered a bundle wrapped in a faded pink fleece blanket, worn thin at the edges and stained by dirt. Inside the makeshift cradle was a baby girl, impossibly tiny against the vastness of the cold metal. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, but her small chest rose and fell steadily. Strands of soft, almost white blonde hair clung to her forehead, and when her eyelids fluttered open, a pair of brilliant blue eyes stared up into Aurum's brown ones. For a heartbeat, the world around them held its breath. Then, instinct, pure and unfaltering, took over. Aurum lowered himself protectively around the infant, his body blocking the chill wind, his breath forming small clouds that misted gently over the baby's head. Elsewhere, 2 blocks away, a woman trudged through the damp streets, her worn boots splashing through shallow puddles. Elsa Morel was in her early 30s, of average height and slight build, with long chestnut hair usually tied into a messy bun and a pair of alert, intelligent hazel eyes that missed little. Her sharp cheekbones and slightly upturned nose gave her a mischievous air, though a closer look revealed a kind of thoughtful weariness beneath her vibrant smile, a mark left by years of freelancing, scraping by job to job, chasing fleeting moments of beauty in a city that too often hid it. Elsa had been a photographer since her teenage years, inspired after her father, a journalist, vanished during a conflict overseas. She carried her battered camera like a talisman, capturing moments of hope to ward off the darkness she knew all too well. On that morning, Elsa had been wandering aimlessly, camera slung around her neck, searching for something, anything, to inspire her next photo series. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, she found herself wandering into the fringes of the scrapyard. Through the mist, she spotted a shadow moving with a strange deliberateness. Squinting, she lifted her camera, adjusting the focus until the scene before her became heartbreakingly clear. A German shepherd, weathered yet dignified, standing guard over a small, fragile bundle in a rusted drum. Without thinking, Elsa began snapping pictures. Each click of the shutter captured not just an image, but a story of loss, of resilience, of an unlikely guardian rising from the ruins of forgotten things. When she finally lowered the camera, her hands trembling slightly, she realized the gravity of what she was witnessing. Setting caution aside, she approached slowly, arms held wide to show she meant no harm. Aurum growled low, a deep, warning rumble vibrating through his chest. But as Elsa crouched at a respectful distance and spoke in soft, soothing tones, the dog seemed to assess her, then reluctantly stepped aside, keeping a wary eye on her. Gently, Elsa peeled back the blanket to check on the baby. The child stirred, her small mouth opening in a silent mewl. Relief flooded Elsa as she realized the baby was alive, though cold and weak. She grabbed her phone with fumbling fingers and called emergency services, rattling off the location as her eyes remained locked on the strange pair before her. The abandoned dog and the abandoned child, clinging together in a world that had forgotten both. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet morning. A battered white van bearing the logo of the Arvenholm Animal Services pulled up alongside a bright yellow ambulance. From the van emerged Officer Julian Tovey, a stout man in his mid-40s with a gruff demeanor, a thick salt-and-pepper beard, and eyes so deeply set they seemed almost hidden beneath his heavy brow. Julian was known among the locals for his bark being worse than his bite. He had a soft spot for strays, a legacy from growing up the son of a veterinarian in the rugged countryside. Julian took one look at Aurum, the battered but noble posture of the dog, and muttered, "You poor bastard," with a mixture of pity and admiration. As paramedics carefully lifted the baby onto a stretcher, Julian approached Aurum slowly, speaking in low tones, coaxing him toward the van. Aurum hesitated, his gaze torn between the departing infant and the unknown man. Only when Elsa knelt beside him, whispering encouragement, did Aurum finally allow the slip of a leash over his head. The baby, barely a whisper of warmth under layers of blankets, was rushed to the city hospital. In the ambulance, one paramedic, a woman with short blonde hair and tired but kind green eyes, jotted down a temporary identifier, Baby Lyra, after the ancient constellation, a name Elsa had suggested when asked what to call the nameless child. Meanwhile, Aurum was transported to a nearby animal shelter where he would be evaluated. Elsa, heart hammering with adrenaline and something else she dared not name yet, uploaded one of the photos she had taken. A shot of Aurum standing sentinel over Lyra, the mist swirling like a veil around them, to her modest social media page with the simple caption, "A silent guardian found in the scrapyard. Hope is never truly lost." By nightfall, the post had gone viral. Thousands of comments poured in, sharing the image, offering help, demanding to know what would happen to the baby and the brave dog who refused to leave her side. In a city numbed by routine hardship and cold gray days, the story of Lyra and Aurum ignited something rare. A flicker of collective warmth. A surge of belief that perhaps, even in the bleakest corners, miracles could be found. And so, without knowing it yet, Arvenholm began to stir awake, drawn together by the unlikely bond between a forgotten dog and a child left to fate, and by the woman who, camera in hand, had refused to look away. The morning sun fought to pierce through the heavy hanging mist that still lingered over Arvenholm, as news of the scrapyard miracle spread like a ripple across the city's tight web of neighborhoods and narrow streets. At the edge of the industrial zone, tucked behind the abandoned Massey Ironworks plant, stood a squat, unassuming house that had once been painted blue, but had long since faded into a muted shade of ash. Its garden was wild, its fence leaning precariously, and yet it exuded a stubborn sort of life, much like the man who lived inside it. Mathis Ravel, aged 55, leaned over a chipped porcelain sink, scrubbing his calloused hands even though they were already clean. He was a man carved from old stone, tall but slightly stooped from years of hard work, his body lean, built on wiry strength rather than muscle. His hair, once thick and chestnut brown, had retreated to the back of his head and faded into a stormy gray, framing a face that was all angles and creases. His deep-set eyes, colored the pale green of worn sea glass, held a haunted look, the kind that spoke of sorrow too long carried alone. Mathis had once been a renowned veterinary surgeon in southern France, known for his gentle hands and stern, quiet brilliance. But grief had redefined him. 5 years earlier, he had lost both his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Ariane, in a car crash on a wet country road. An accident he had replayed in endless, self-punishing detail. Since that day, Mathis had abandoned his practice, left his homeland, and drifted until he landed in Arvenholm, a place where no one asked too many questions. Here, he patched old engines for cash, fixed neighbors' fences, and disappeared behind the silence of his small house. A diagnosis of mild depression had followed him like a ghost, but he refused medication, believing penance had to be felt, not dulled. That morning, as he nursed a bitter cup of coffee, he saw the image that would change everything. On the cracked screen of his aging laptop, Elsa Morel's viral photograph glowed. A German shepherd standing like a sentinel over a newborn baby, their breath misting in the cold scrapyard air. Mathis froze, his heart squeezing painfully in his chest. He stared, unable to tear his gaze away. It was not the baby alone that gripped him, it was the dog. Even through the photograph's grain, he could see the tension in the animal's stance, the careful protectiveness, the loyalty burned into every line of its battered body. He sat back slowly, fingers trembling slightly as he traced the image on the screen. An inexplicable feeling surged up, a connection raw and undeniable. It was as if the fragments of himself, broken and scattered, recognized something kindred in the dog and the child. Mathis closed the laptop with a sharp snap. Without overthinking, he pulled on his threadbare coat and stepped out into the mist, his boots thudding against the broken pavement with purpose. Meanwhile, across town at the Arvenholm Municipal Animal Shelter, Aurum lay curled on a thin blanket in a steel-floored kennel. He had not eaten much, refusing the dry kibble offered to him, and he paced restlessly whenever the staff approached. Lana Prescott, the shelter's intake coordinator, a plump woman in her late 40s with a kind smile but tired eyes, noted his behavior with a sigh. Lana, who had worked with rescue animals for over 2 decades, recognized the signs of a working dog displaced from his purpose. She scratched notes on her clipboard, loyal, anxious, high intelligence. But her heart ached for the creature. When Mathis arrived at the shelter, Lana eyed him warily at first, her professional instincts sharp. Dressed in a battered coat, jeans patched at the knees, and heavy boots, he looked like a man used to hardship. But when Mathis spoke, his voice low and precise, explaining he wanted to foster both the baby and the dog, if allowed, something softened in her. She led him to Aurum's kennel without another word. At first sight, Mathis and Aurum merely stared at each other, 2 broken souls appraising the damage of the other. Slowly, Mathis knelt, holding his hand out palm down. Aurum crept forward cautiously, nose twitching. After a long moment, he placed his head under Mathis's hand, as if surrendering a burden too heavy to carry alone. Lana's heart squeezed tight at the sight. "He's yours if you want him," she said softly. Arrangements were made quickly. At the same time, across town, social services processed emergency paperwork to find a temporary guardian for the baby, now officially named Lyra Morell, since Elsa had insisted her name not be forgotten amidst bureaucracy. The hospital's pediatric team confirmed Lyra was healthy apart from mild dehydration and exposure symptoms. Mathis, through sheer force of quiet will, convinced the authorities to consider him for temporary guardianship. He had experience with medical care. He had a stable, if modest, living situation. And most importantly, he had shown genuine concern where others had only gawked at the sensational story. Nora Van Dalen, the assigned caseworker, a brisk woman in her early 40s with sleek blonde hair and an air of no-nonsense efficiency, met Mathis at the shelter to assess him. She questioned him sharply about his intentions, his past, his resources. Though wary, Nora was ultimately moved by his candor and the evident bond already forming between him and the stoic German shepherd. That evening, Mathis returned home with Aurum trotting silently beside him, the dog moving as if he belonged there already. Inside the house, Mathis set up a temporary nursery in the sunroom, cleaning out the dust and setting down a battered but sturdy crib salvaged from a neighbor's garage sale. He had little by way of toys or baby clothes, but he had bought what he could afford: soft blankets, a few bottles, a second-hand stroller. When Lyra arrived, swaddled tightly and carried by a nurse, she was placed gently into the crib. Aurum, ever watchful, lay curled beneath the crib without command, resting his chin on his paws, his deep brown eyes half-lidded but vigilant. Mathis sat in an old rocking chair nearby, watching the small life they had both somehow been entrusted with. The baby stirred, cooed softly, then settled back into sleep, one tiny hand curled toward the sky as if reaching for something unseen. Outside, the city of Arvenholm buzzed with the noise of daily life, cars honking, neon signs flickering. But inside that battered little house, a pocket of impossible peace had formed. Mathis felt it settle over him like a heavy, comforting blanket. Unfamiliar, but welcome. He stroked Aurum's battered head and whispered, "You and me, old boy. Looks like we've got a second chance, whether we deserve it or not." As night fell, a cold rain began to beat against the windows, but inside the little home by the dead factory, the unlikely family huddled together against the world, held fast by the first fragile threads of something stronger than fear, stronger even than grief: hope. The days after Lyra's arrival settled into a strange, exhausting kind of miracle, stretching and reshaping the quiet life that Mathis Ravel had carved out for himself. The small house, once a bastion of silence where dust motes danced lazily in shafts of light, now pulsed with sound and life: thin, newborn wails, the rhythmic creak of the old rocking chair, the click of Aurum's nails pacing restlessly across the worn wooden floors. Mathis, unused to the raw, unrelenting demands of a tiny, fragile life, found himself both humbled and terrified by the magnitude of it. Caring for Lyra was nothing like the surgical precision of veterinary work he once excelled at. There was no textbook that could tell him how to quiet a hungry cry at 3 a.m, or how to read the subtle shift in her breathing that meant she was about to wake. His hands, once steady over operating tables, now fumbled with baby bottles and snaps on minuscule onesies. Mathis, tall and lanky with fingers meant for intricate work, now felt clumsy, awkward, bending his long frame awkwardly over the crib to lift her, cradling her tiny body as if she might break under his touch. His sleep, never deep since the accident years ago, became fractured into brief, light dozes. The circles under his pale green eyes darkened, and the lines etched into his weathered face deepened. But there was something different now. A lightness that began to slowly crack through the grief-hardened shell he had worn for so long. Throughout it all, Aurum remained an unwavering sentinel. The German shepherd's loyalty, once trained into him and now perhaps shaped by deeper instincts, manifested in ways that even Mathis, a former vet, found moving. At night, Aurum lay pressed against the crib, his ears flicking at every whimper, his heavy sighs timed almost perfectly to Lyra's restless shifting. When Lyra woke crying, it was often Aurum's gentle, steady breathing that calmed her faster than any lullaby Mathis could muster. Sometimes, in the long silver hours before dawn, Mathis would sit with a mug of bitter coffee cooling in his hands, watching the two of them, baby and dog, finding comfort in each other's presence, and feel something close to awe. Twice a week, Nora Van Dalen came to the house for wellness checks. Nora, a Dutch woman who had lived in Arvenholm for over a decade, was in her early 40s, with short ash-blonde hair, usually pinned in a no-nonsense bun at the nape of her neck. She dressed neatly but practically, favoring sensible cardigans and slacks, her slight build and soft features offset by an unmistakable firmness in her manner. Nora had the professional calm of someone who had seen every shade of human struggle but carried a small silver cross on a chain around her neck, a quiet token of her belief in second chances. Years working in social services had taught her skepticism, but it had not yet extinguished her hope. At first, her visits were brisk, clinical, checking Lyra's vitals, inspecting the cleanliness of the home, observing interactions between man, dog, and child. But over time, as she watched Mathis struggle and persevere, as she noted the genuine care in every one of his awkward movements, her approach softened. On one visit, she stayed a little longer, accepting a cup of instant coffee Mathis hastily brewed, and sitting at the small kitchen table littered with baby bottles, newspapers, and half-fixed mechanical parts. That day, as Lyra napped in the sun-warmed crib, Nora asked about the faded black-and-white photographs that lined the mantel above the cold fireplace. Mathis, usually reticent, surprised himself by answering. He spoke in low, measured tones about Claire and Ariane, the laughter that once filled these rooms, the plans that were shattered, the long years afterward spent in silence and regret. Nora listened without interrupting, her hands curled around her chipped coffee mug, her hazel eyes steady and full of something Mathis could not immediately name, understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. In turn, she told him a little about her own past. Growing up as a pastor's daughter in a small village where compassion was measured against impossibly rigid standards, and how moving to Arvenholm had been her own rebellion against a life mapped out too tightly by expectation. It was not a grand confessional exchange. Rather, it was the kind of slow, tentative sharing that built bridges not with grand gestures, but with simple human acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Aurum continued to weave himself into the fabric of their new life. Mathis quickly realized that the dog had an almost supernatural awareness of Lyra's needs. When Lyra's cries escalated into frantic wailing, Aurum would bark, not loudly, but sharply enough to summon Mathis if he had dozed off or been distracted fixing something. If a visitor approached the door, a courier, a neighbor, even a stray cat, Aurum would place himself between the baby and the perceived threat, his stance low, ready, protective, without being aggressive. Mathis marveled at the dog's intuition and came to rely on it almost instinctively. One rainy afternoon, as heavy drops battered the thin roof and turned the streets to rivers of mud, a minor crisis erupted. Lyra had spiked a low fever, her soft cheeks burning under Mathis's worried hands. He bundled her carefully, cradled her against his chest, and prepared to drive her to the clinic, only to find his battered old truck stubbornly refusing to start. Panic surged, brief, cold, sharp. But before Mathis could sink into helplessness, Nora arrived for her scheduled visit, umbrella in hand, soaked through but cheerful. Without hesitation, she swept the infant from his arms, wrapping her expertly in an extra blanket she always kept in her car for emergencies. "Get in," she ordered briskly, and together they drove through the storm to the pediatric clinic on Hemsworth Avenue. Lyra's fever turned out to be nothing more than a teething spike, a normal hurdle in infant care. But to Mathis, the experience crystallized the realization that he was no longer capable of facing every storm alone. That night, exhausted but relieved, he sat on the living room floor with Lyra sleeping against his chest and Aurum stretched out beside them. He looked at Nora, who lingered awkwardly in the doorway, as if unsure whether she should leave or stay. "Thank you," he said simply, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a shared recognition of two people rebuilding themselves in small, imperfect ways. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper. Inside, amidst the clutter of a life hastily assembled but fiercely protected, Mathis felt, for the first time in years, the faint, stubborn pulse of belonging. Lyra stirred against him, her tiny hand clutching the fabric of his shirt, and Aurum's slow, steady breathing filled the space between them with a lullaby older than any song. In that modest, worn house on the forgotten edge of Arvenholm, a new rhythm had taken root, a cadence of cries, barks, and heartbeats that, against all odds, sounded very much like the beginning of a home. The crispness of early autumn had begun to creep into Arvenholm, dressing the battered streets in pale morning mist and littering the sidewalks with the first fallen leaves. The house behind the old ironworks, once a relic of sorrow, now pulsed with a fragile energy as Lyra's laughter filled the corners that had once known only silence. Yet, with every sunrise, Mathis felt the weight of impermanence pressing against his heart, a quiet, relentless reminder that the small, miraculous world he had built with Aurum and Lyra might not be his to keep. The knock came on a Saturday morning when Mathis was sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, showing Lyra how to stack brightly colored blocks. Aurum lifted his head from where he lay at Lyra's side, a low growl humming from deep within his chest. Mathis rose, brushing sawdust and dog hair from his jeans, and approached the door with cautious steps. Standing on the porch was a young woman, no more than 20, shivering slightly despite the thick, oversized coat that dwarfed her slight frame. Her hair was a matted tangle of dark brown waves tucked beneath a gray knit beanie, and her pale face was framed by sharp, almost delicate features that had lost the softness of youth to hardship. Her hazel eyes, wide and hollowed by exhaustion, darted nervously from Mathis to the interior of the house. "My name is Annika Falco," she said, her voice brittle like old glass, carrying an accent that hinted she had grown up somewhere near the city's rougher edges. I think you have my daughter." Mathis stiffened, his mind scrambling to process her words. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, instinctively shielding the warm, precarious world inside from this ghost who had appeared from the mist. "Explain," he said, his voice low and even. Annika wrung her hands together, biting her lower lip until it turned white. She was short and thin, too thin, as if she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. Her movements were fidgety, full of the nervous energy of someone who had spent too long looking over her shoulder. "Her name," she began, her throat working around the word. "I named her Callie. I gave birth to her in secret. My family, they wouldn't let me keep her. My boyfriend, She trailed off, the words crumbling. "He was violent. I had nowhere to go, no one to help. I panicked." Mathis listened in silence, his face an unmoving mask, while a war raged inside him. Part of him wanted to believe her, to believe that someone so small and broken had been forced into an impossible corner. Another part of him, the part hardened by years of loss, screamed caution. "I didn't want to leave her," Annika whispered, "but I thought, if I left her somewhere someone could find her. Somewhere people wouldn't just walk past. Maybe she'd have a chance." Her voice cracked on the last words, and for a moment she was just a frightened child herself, standing in the mist, begging for redemption. Inside, Lyra, or Callie, as Annika claimed, began to fuss. Mathis turned instinctively at the sound, and in that fraction of a second Annika tried to look past him into the house, her face crumpling with yearning. Before Mathis could respond, a car pulled up at the curb. A woman stepped out, tall and lithe, her long chestnut hair coiled into a loose braid, a leather camera bag slung over one shoulder. Elsa Morrow, the freelance photographer who had first captured the image of Aurum and Lyra, had been following the story closely, driven by a gnawing sense that it was far from over. Elsa had the easy grace of someone used to moving unseen, yet her keen hazel eyes missed little. Today they were narrowed with sharp suspicion. She approached cautiously, flashing a small apologetic smile at Mathis before turning her attention to Annika. "I am sorry to intrude," Elsa said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been documenting this story. I just wanted to understand more. It's important." Annika visibly recoiled at the sight of the camera, pulling her coat tighter around her. Mathis stepped between them, one hand unconsciously brushing the doorframe. "Now's not the time," he said curtly, but Elsa didn't leave. She stood back, observing, her instincts prickling. Something in Annika's story felt off, the jagged way she spoke, the inconsistencies in her body language, the strange lack of detail about Lyra's early days. Annika, sensing the scrutiny, turned her hollow eyes back to Mathis. "Please," she whispered. "I just want to see her. I need to—" Mathis hesitated, the pull of compassion warring with the protective instincts that had rooted themselves in his bones. His mind raced back to the night spent holding Lyra against his chest, the way she clutched his shirt with tiny fists, the quiet trust she offered without question. Could he tear that bond apart on the word of a stranger? "I need to verify your story," Mathis said finally, his voice steady but not unkind. "I won't just hand her over without being sure." Annika sagged against the porch railing, nodding numbly, as if she had expected nothing less. Later that day, Mathis contacted Nora Van Dalen, explaining everything with careful precision. Nora listened without interruption, her face unreadable over the crackling line. She promised to open a formal investigation and arrange for DNA testing. Mathis hung up, feeling as though the air itself had thickened around him, each breath heavier than the last. Elsa stayed a while longer, sitting silently on the porch steps, her camera forgotten at her side. As the sun dipped low, she finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Be careful," she said. "Sometimes, people who lose everything will say anything to get it back, and sometimes they're telling the truth." Mathis said nothing, only nodded, watching as she disappeared into the lengthening shadows. Inside, Aurum had positioned himself squarely between the crib and the door, his amber eyes fixed and unblinking. Mathis knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's broad head. Lyra gurgled softly in her sleep, her tiny fingers curling towards the sky, oblivious to the storm gathering outside. And Mathis, for the first time since finding her, realized with chilling clarity that love alone might not be enough to keep her safe. The gray sky over Arvenholm hung low and heavy as the city woke to another brittle morning. the kind where the street seemed suspended in a perpetual pause, waiting for something to shift. In the small house near the dead ironworks, Mathis Ravel sat at the kitchen table, his rough hands cradling a chipped mug of black coffee gone cold. Across from him sat Nora Van Dalen, her notepad resting on the table between them, her pen motionless, her eyes trained on him with a steady patience that Mathis found both comforting and unnerving. Nora was dressed in her usual muted tones. Today, a charcoal blazer over a cream turtleneck, practical slacks tucked into low boots. Her ash-blonde hair was pinned back in its typical no-nonsense style, a few loose strands softening her otherwise brisk appearance. She was a woman shaped by pragmatism, by years of walking into homes filled with uncertainty, pain, or hope, never knowing which she would find. Yet she carried an underlying warmth, the kind that crept up slowly like sunlight through thick clouds. "We received confirmation this morning," Nora said finally, her voice even, professional. "The DNA test verifies that Anika Falco is Lyra's biological mother." The words hung between them, heavier than any winter frost. Mathis stared at his coffee, feeling an invisible thread in his chest pull taut and fray at the edges. Nora hesitated, giving him time. She was good at that, letting silence do its work. Finally, Mathis looked up, his pale green eyes clouded but steady. And now, she set her notepad aside. "We organize a custody hearing, a preliminary one, informal, just you, Annika, myself, and Officer Keene to witness. No lawyers yet, unless either side requests it. The goal is to make a recommendation to family court based on the best interest of the child." Officer Keene had been assigned to oversee Lyra's case once foul play had been ruled out. He was a tall, stoop-shouldered man in his 50s with thinning ginger hair and a perpetually wind-chapped face. Known for his quiet sense of humor and his methodical approach, Keene had built a reputation for fairness in a system that often seemed anything but. Mathis rubbed a hand over his face, the bristles of his short beard rasping under his calloused fingers. He had known this was coming. From the moment Annika had appeared, trembling and desperate, he had known. Still, it didn't make the reality any easier to bear. "She left her," Mathis said, not with anger, but with a deep, abiding ache. "Left her in the cold, alone." Nora nodded slowly. "She did, but circumstances matter, and guilt matters. The court will look at her current ability to provide a safe, loving home. People can make mistakes they regret for a lifetime." Mathis let out a long breath. "I made mistakes too." And because he needed someone to understand, because he needed to explain why he clung to Lyra not as an act of pity but of redemption, he began to speak of Claire and Ariane. He told Nora about the rainy night when the phone call came, about rushing to the hospital and the endless corridors that smelled of bleach and despair. About holding Claire's hand as she slipped away. About the tiny, broken form of Ariane lying too still in a sterile crib, machines blinking uselessly around her. He spoke not with theatrics, but with the hollow, scraped-out voice of a man recounting the geography of his own ruin. Nora listened, her hazel eyes glinting with unshed tears she refused to let fall. When he finished, silence reclaimed the room. Aurum, lying beneath the table, let out a low sigh, his body pressed close to Mathis's leg as if to anchor him. "I thought," Mathis said quietly, "that whatever penance I had coming, it was fair. That I didn't deserve to heal. Then she arrived, Lyra. And for the first time, I remembered what it felt like to hope." Nora reached across the table, not touching him but setting her hand palm up between them, a silent offer of shared weight. Mathis didn't take it, but he nodded, the smallest gesture of gratitude. The custody meeting was set for the following afternoon in a small room at the Family Services building. The room was plain. Cream walls, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, a battered conference table surrounded by metal chairs. No courtrooms, no gavels, just a place for difficult conversations. Annika arrived first, her hair brushed and clean, her coat replaced by a worn but tidy sweater. She sat wringing her hands in her lap, her face pale but determined. Officer Keene stood near the door, arms folded across his broad chest, his presence a silent reassurance. Mathis entered carrying Lyra against his chest, her tiny body bundled in a soft blue blanket. He had dressed her in a simple white onesie, adorned with tiny golden stars. Aurum, though not allowed in the building, waited faithfully outside the glass doors, sitting so still he seemed carved from stone. Lyra, sensing the tension, whimpered softly. Mathis rocked her gently, feeling her calm under his touch. Nora began the proceedings, her voice a calm current guiding them forward. She outlined the situation: biological connection, abandonment under duress, the bond formed between Mathis and Lyra, the necessity of considering Lyra's emotional stability. Then she asked Annika to speak. Annika's voice trembled at first, but gained strength as she spoke of the nights she had spent awake in shelters, the jobs she had scraped together, the therapy sessions she had attended to deal with her trauma. She spoke of the way guilt had gnawed at her, how she had followed the news, praying the baby she had left behind had found safety. Mathis listened, his heart a raw, open thing. He believed her, or at least he believed the regret. Pain, he knew, could twist good people into desperate shapes. When it was his turn, Mathis stood and spoke quietly of Lyra's laughter filling the hollows of his house, of the way Aurum watched over her with a devotion that defied language. He spoke of late nights pacing with her in his arms, singing songs he barely remembered, and of how he had begun to dream again because of her. When Nora asked him for his recommendation, Mathis swallowed the lump in his throat and said, "She deserves her mother. But I want to stay in her life. She deserves all the love she can get." A silence followed, heavy with meaning. Before leaving, Mathis placed a small object into Annika's trembling hands, a pocket-sized voice recorder. He had filled it with the soft breathing and occasional low whines of Aurum, the lullabies of a dog who had guarded Lyra's nights. "For her," Mathis said simply, "when she can't sleep." Annika clutched it to her chest, tears slipping free despite her effort to hold them back. As Mathis walked out into the cold afternoon, Aurum rose to meet him. He placed a hand on the dog's broad head, steadying himself. They would not return to an empty home. It was filled with memories now. Memories that would never fade, even if the child they had saved had to walk another path. The days that followed Lyra's departure stretched long and thin, like threads pulled too tight across an old loom, threatening to snap at the slightest strain. The house near the ironworks, once alive with the babble of a child and the soft shuffle of small hands exploring the world, sank back into silence. Dust gathered in the corners again. Shadows lingered longer across the floorboards. Mathis moved through it all like a ghost, a man untethered from the fragile, precious life he had rebuilt. Aurum mirrored his grief in a way no human could have. The German shepherd, whose broad shoulders and sharp, intelligent eyes had once bristled with energy, now lay listless beside the empty crib. His once glossy black and tan coat grew duller, his appetite all but disappeared. Mathis tried coaxing him with cooked meats, with long walks, with toys he had fashioned himself, but Aurum would only nudge the food with his nose and return to his vigil beneath the crib, where Lyra's scent still faintly clung to the blankets. Mornings were the worst. Mathis would wake from shallow, fitful dreams, expecting the chirp of Lyra's cries or the soft patter of her tiny feet on the worn rugs. Instead, there was only the groan of the old house settling around him and the distant rattle of trains passing through Arvenholm's forgotten industrial heart. He poured coffee he never finished, repaired things that didn't need fixing, lost himself in idle tasks around the workshop. Even the mechanical comforts of tightening bolts and hammering rusted nails brought no solace. Without realizing it, he began to speak aloud to Aurum more and more, filling the aching void with one-sided conversations. The dog would lift his head sometimes as if listening, but his eyes remained dim, waiting for something Mathis could no longer give. One dull Thursday, as rain spattered against the windows and the city huddled beneath a gray sky, there came another knock at the door. This one softer, almost hesitant. Mathis opened it to find Elsa Morel standing there, the ever-present camera bag slung across her shoulder, a bundle of something wrapped carefully in her arms. Elsa looked much the same. Slim, with windswept chestnut hair tucked into a loose braid, dressed in a worn green field jacket and jeans tucked into scuffed boots. Her hazel eyes, usually lively and quick, were tempered by something more gentle today, a cautious hope. "I thought you might need company," she said simply, lifting the bundle slightly. It was an album, thick with printed photographs. Mathis stepped aside and Elsa entered, her presence bringing a faint gust of city air and something harder to define, an insistence on life, on movement, on continuation. She set the album carefully on the kitchen table, brushing away the fine dust that had settled there. "I've been working on something," she said, opening the book to reveal glossy pages filled with images that stopped Mathis's breath short. There was Lyra, wrapped snug in her blue blanket, tiny hands clutched around Aurum's thick mane. There was Aurum lying beneath the crib, eyes half closed in watchful peace. Lyra toddling across the cracked stone walkway with Aurum trailing behind like a patient guardian. Lyra asleep on Mathis's chest as he rocked back and forth in the battered chair. "I called it Second Homes," Elsa said, her voice soft. "Stories of finding family in unexpected places." Mathis turned the pages slowly, reverently, the pictures dragging old emotions through him like tides pulling at buried stones. At last, he looked up, his voice hoarse. "Why bring it here?" Elsa hesitated, fiddling with the strap of her camera bag. "I want to do a public exhibit, here in Arvenholm. Not for profit, not for fame, just to remind people that sometimes it doesn't take blood to build something sacred. You and Aurum, you're part of that story. You're part of what gives it weight." Mathis shook his head at first, instinctively recoiling from the idea of bearing the fragile thing he had held close. But Elsa pressed on, her words gentle but insistent. "There's too much silence already. Too many people convinced they're alone. You showed them something different without even trying." She left the album with him, refusing to stay, sensing he needed time to wrestle with himself. As the door clicked shut behind her, Mathis sat there, the pictures laid out before him like an offering, a reminder that even grief could give birth to beauty. Days passed before he called her, a single terse message left on her voicemail. "Do it, but don't make me a hero." The exhibition was held 2 weeks later in a refurbished warehouse on the edge of Arvenholm's Arts District. Elsa transformed the cold concrete space with strings of warm lights and panels of white canvas. The photographs hung in simple wooden frames accompanied by small handwritten captions. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a massive print of Aurum and Lyra in the scrapyard, mist swirling around them like a veil. The dog's battered body curved protectively around the tiny bundle. Elsa titled it simply, Guardian. People came in waves: students, workers, pensioners, young couples holding hands. Some came because they had seen the viral story months ago. Others came because whispers of something pure had spread through the city like a much-needed fire. Mathis stood at the edge of the room, hands in his pockets, uncomfortable but rooted. He wore a plain brown jacket and scuffed boots, blending into the crowd. Aurum, freshly bathed and brushed to a muted shine, sat beside him, his posture proud but relaxed. There were moments during the evening when Mathis caught glimpses of faces staring at the photographs with unguarded emotion. An elderly woman wiping her eyes. A young boy tracing the outline of Aurum's shape with awe. A father lifting his daughter onto his shoulders so she could better see the images. Elsa moved among the crowd like a silent conductor, smiling, nodding, sometimes answering questions but often letting the photographs speak for themselves. When she finally reached Mathis, she simply said, "You gave them hope." Mathis didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice not to break. Instead, he looked down at Aurum, who returned his gaze with a slow, deliberate blink, the faint thump of his tail against the floor the only sound between them. Later that night, as they walked back to the house through the soft drizzle, Mathis carried the small mementos Elsa had given him, a framed print of Guardian and a bundle of notes visitors had left at the exhibit. Some thanked him. Some simply shared their own stories of loss, of finding love again when they thought it impossible. Inside the house, he hung the photograph above the fireplace where the old family portraits once sat. It seemed fitting somehow, not a replacement, but an evolution. As Aurum curled once more beneath the now empty crib, Mathis whispered into the dimness, "She's not gone. She's everywhere now." And, for the first time in many days, the emptiness inside him loosened, just a little, as he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, absence could also be a kind of presence after all. The first signs of trouble came on a stormy evening when Mathis sat alone in the dim kitchen, the rain hammering against the windows like urgent hands. He was halfway through repairing a faulty lamp when his old cell phone buzzed on the counter. The number was unfamiliar, but something inside him, something ancient and uneasy, made him answer. "Mr. Ravel?" came a woman's voice, clipped yet gentle. "This is Supervisor Ellen Vance from Child Protective Services. I'm afraid there's been an accident involving Annika Falco." Mathis stood frozen, the world narrowing to the sound of his own breathing. "She's alive," Ellen continued quickly, sensing the tension. "But her injuries are serious. She's been admitted to Arvenholm General's long-term care unit. Her recovery will be uncertain." "And Lyra?" The words tore from Mathis's throat, hoarse and desperate. "She's safe," Ellen reassured him. "But with no immediate family able to care for her, she's been temporarily placed back into foster care." Silence fell between them, stretched taut across miles of storm. Mathis gripped the counter until his knuckles whitened. The idea of Lyra, small and confused, shuffled from stranger to stranger, was unbearable. Ellen cleared her throat delicately. "Given your prior guardianship and the bond observed, you are eligible to apply for custody again. It would require expedited evaluation, but I'll do it," Mathis said immediately. No hesitation. No doubt. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, inspections, interviews. Nora Van Dalen took personal charge of the process, her usual professional detachment softened by genuine concern. She arrived at Mathis's home early each morning, carrying armfuls of forms and folders. Dressed in thick wool coats against the November chill, her cheeks reddened by the wind, she looked simultaneously exhausted and determined. A woman fighting battles far beyond what the system allowed. "This isn't standard," Nora admitted one afternoon as she shuffled through background check results at the kitchen table. "But after everything, you're more her family than anyone." There was gratitude in Mathis's tired smile, but also something fierce, protective. He had failed once before to save those he loved. He would not fail again. Meanwhile, Elsa Morrow, driven by instincts both professional and personal, approached the story from another angle. She contacted old acquaintances at Arvenholm's local media outlet, the Evening Beacon, a modest but respected paper, and proposed a feature not about tragedy but about resilience. Elsa, with her quiet authority and unshakable sense for human stories, knew precisely how to frame it. A man and his dog answering a second call to love. A city pulling together to protect one of its own. She spent days interviewing Mathis, carefully, respectfully, capturing the nuances of his gruff kindness, the silent strength of Aurum, and the still tender memory of a child's laughter filling a house built on grief. Elsa's photos, raw, unpolished, achingly real, showed Mathis sanding down an old crib he had found discarded behind a church, showed Aurum sitting vigilantly outside the social services office as Mathis submitted his custody application, showed the empty swing set in the cracked yard, waiting. When the article and photographs were published under the title Second Chances, the man, the dog, and the little girl who wouldn't be forgotten, the response from the public was overwhelming. Donations poured into Lyra's trust fund. Strangers left notes taped to Mathis's door, messages of hope, of thanks, of solidarity. For the first time in years, the house by the ironworks did not feel isolated. It felt watched over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity suspended between hope and dread, the call came. Nora's voice, lighter than Mathis had ever heard it, carried across the line. "You're approved, Mathis. Temporary custody for now, pending final adoption procedures. She's waiting for you." When Mathis arrived at the Child Services Center, Aurum riding in the passenger seat with stiff, excited posture, he felt like a man stepping into a dream he hadn't dared believe in. The center was a sterile, echoing building, its walls decorated with childlike murals in soft, hopeful colors. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a halo of frizzy brown hair, led them down a corridor without speaking, as if she too sensed the sacredness of the moment. They entered a bright playroom filled with scattered toys. In the center sat Lyra, smaller than Mathis remembered, bundled in a pink coat 2 sizes too big. Her hair had grown longer, curling softly at the ends. She was stacking wooden blocks with mechanical focus, her tiny brow furrowed. Mathis knelt, unable to breathe. Aurum moved first. With a low, keening whimper that broke the room's heavy stillness, he padded forward, tail low, body trembling with contained emotion. Lyra turned at the sound. For a heartbeat, she simply stared, as if trying to piece together a dream remembered too suddenly. Then her face broke open into a smile so radiant it seemed to banish the winter light from the windows. She dropped her blocks and ran on unsteady legs straight toward the dog. "Aurum!" she cried, her voice high and sweet and cracked with joy. The German shepherd met her halfway, pressing his great head into her tiny hands, letting out a soft, chuffing whine. Lyra wrapped her arms around his thick neck, burying her face into his fur as if she could climb inside and never leave again. Mathis bowed his head, swallowing against the lump in his throat. When Lyra finally looked up, her blue eyes locked on Mathis. She toddled forward, one hand still clutching Aurum's scruff, the other reaching out. "Dada," she said simply. And with that single fragile word, Mattis Ravel's world, damaged, rebuilt, stitched together with sorrow and stubborn hope, came fully, blessedly alive again. Spring unfurled its soft green fingers across Arvenholm, chasing away the last stubborn remnants of frost. The once worn streets now shimmered with puddles catching golden light, and the hum of life returned to the city's forgotten corners. In the battered house near the dead ironworks, a different kind of renewal had taken root, one stitched from laughter, dog fur, and the small bright voice of a little girl rediscovering her place in the world. Mattis Ravel moved through his days with a purpose he had not known in years. The deep lines around his sea-green eyes remained, and his hair, peppered heavily with gray, still refused the taming of a comb, but the old burden in his posture had lifted. Each morning began with Lyra's footsteps pattering down the hallway, a shriek of delighted laughter as she leapt onto Mathis's bed, followed closely by Auram's heavy paws and his contented huff. The garage, once cluttered with rusting tools and the remains of forgotten projects, had been transformed into a playroom under Mathis's patient hands. He had cleared it out entirely, sanding the floor smooth, patching cracks in the walls, painting them in bright hues of blue and green. He built a low shelf for Lyra's growing collection of books and toys, installed a tiny art corner complete with a battered easel, and hung fairy lights along the ceiling beams, creating a soft, perpetual starlight. Auram remained Lyra's silent guardian through it all, his sleek black and tan coat gleaming once more under the attention of regular brushing. Though he moved with the measured caution of a dog who had seen too much, his eyes were alive again, especially when Lyra was near. Wherever she wandered, Auram followed, his sturdy body positioning itself between her and any perceived danger with a loyalty that asked for nothing in return. One warm Saturday morning, Mattis stood in the backyard repairing a broken garden fence when a familiar figure approached the gate. Annika Falco, now leaner but steadier, waved hesitantly. She wore simple jeans and a faded denim jacket, her dark brown hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Her face bore the faint scars of her accident, faint lines at her temple and a slight limp. But her hazel eyes, once clouded with guilt and fear, now shone with cautious hope. Mattis wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. Auram, sensing no threat, stood at ease by Lyra's side. "I've been meaning to come sooner," Annika said, her voice rough from nerves, "but I wanted to be stronger for her." She explained how, during her months in the rehabilitation center, she had worked not only on her physical recovery but on her life, attending counseling, securing steady part-time work at a bookstore in the neighboring district, and renting a small apartment 2 blocks from the public library. "I'm not here to take her back," she said quickly, seeing the flicker of guardedness in Mathis's eyes. "I know where she belongs, but if you'd let me, I'd like to be part of her life, as someone who loves her, maybe an aunt, or—" Her voice broke. Mattis studied her for a long moment. In Annika's posture he saw no entitlement, no selfishness, only a quiet plea, and the beginnings of something new. He thought of Lyra, of her right to a world filled with people who loved her without conditions. Finally he nodded. "Only if it's always about what's best for her." Annika smiled through tears. "Always." From that day forward, Annika became a gentle, peripheral presence in Lyra's life, joining them for occasional Saturday afternoons at the park, bringing books and little painted stones she crafted herself, slipping seamlessly into the extended family that Mattis and Auram had built around their girl. Lyra, now 4 years old, thrived in the sunlight of their shared days. Her blonde hair, grown long and often tied into messy pigtails, bounced as she ran. Her blue eyes, once wide and uncertain, now sparkled with mischief and joy. She had inherited her foster father's stubbornness and Auram's quiet vigilance, becoming a child equal parts laughter and fierce loyalty. One particularly brilliant afternoon, under a sky so blue it seemed impossible, they visited the large city park, a sprawling maze of meadows, old oaks, and winding trails. Mathis sat on a weathered bench, a thermos of coffee resting beside him, watching as Lyra and Aurum played among the wildflowers. Aurum, patient and strong, allowed Lyra to clamber onto his broad back with the practiced ease of a child who had done it 100 times before. Her small hands buried themselves in the thick fur at his shoulders as she nudged him forward with tiny heels. "Giddy up, Knight Aurum," she squealed, her laughter ringing out across the park. Mathis chuckled under his breath, warmth blooming in his chest. Nearby, parents turned to smile, some lifting their phones to snap photos, captivated by the sight of the loyal dog and his giggling rider. Then, as Aurum trotted in slow circles and the spring air danced with the scent of fresh earth and blossoms, Lyra turned toward Mathis. Her cheeks were flushed with happiness, her blue eyes wide with earnest excitement. "Daddy," she called out, her voice strong and clear. "When I grow up, I'm going to tell everyone how Aurum saved me. I'm going to tell all my friends." Mathis felt his throat tighten painfully. He forced a smile, raising a hand in a wave, but his vision blurred against his will. He blinked rapidly, the tears falling silently anyway, tracing clean lines down the rugged map of his weathered face. He whispered hoarsely, more to himself than anyone else, "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." And in that moment, under the wide, forgiving sky, Mathis knew that the miracle that had begun in the cold wasteland of a scrapyard had never truly ended. It lived on. In every footstep Lyra took, in every beat of Aurum's loyal heart, in every sunrise that cast golden light over their small, battered, beautiful home. It lived on because they had chosen, again and again, to believe in second chances. And in the end, that belief had built them something stronger than blood, stronger than loss. A true, enduring home. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not descend from the heavens with a roar of angels or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in a second-hand blanket, carried on the broad back of a loyal dog, or found in the scarred hands of a man who thought his time for love had long passed. Lyra, Mathis, and Aurum remind us that family is not always written in blood, but in acts of loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional love. They show us that even in a world shadowed by loss and brokenness, God plants seeds of hope, hidden in places we least expect, waiting for hearts willing to see them. In our daily lives, amid the noise, the deadlines, the small heartbreaks and big worries, may we never lose sight of those quiet miracles. The kindness of a stranger, the loyalty of a pet, the small hand reaching up for ours. These are the fingerprints of God. The proof that grace, though unseen, moves through every crack and corner of this imperfect world. May God bless you, dear friends, wherever you are watching from. May He fill your homes with laughter, your hearts with compassion, and your journeys with unexpected miracles. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and your own stories of everyday miracles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our growing family. Every time you do, you help spread light just a little further into the world. And remember, miracles still happen. Sometimes they are just waiting for someone like you to believe.